Welcome back. My name is Steve Hyde. I'm a missionary here in Cambodia working in church planting and training pastors around the world. We're going to continue our lesson today, and I'm going to talk about the difference between rural church planting and urban church planting. And we're using as our text this book, Kingdom Invasion, that I wrote on church planting, talking about different methodology throughout the world. And specifically, the methodology I'm teaching about on church planting is for rural church planting and for smaller groups. And I want to highlight right now the difference between urban church planting and rural church planting because there's significant differences. So we're in chapter 1, page 18 through the end of the chapter will be this lesson, talking about the difference between rural and urban church planting. So I'd like you to just consider, as you will, I don't know, people in the city think that people in the countryside live like them, think like them. They live in different houses and that kind of stuff. But actually, people's worldview is according to their own environment. So people in an urban situation have one worldview, they have one way of thinking of the world, and people in rural contexts have a completely different other way looking at the world. Even if they're the same ethnic group, they have the same language, there are differences that relate to church planting because the people themselves are quite different in the way they think. So let's just consider, if you will, lifestyles. I don't know, like I said, we're focusing on rural church planting, and so we're going to talk about the difference between a lifestyle in a city. I often have a privilege of going and teaching and visiting in a country called Singapore. And if you don't know about Singapore, it's just one small, they call it the little red dot, but it's a small city, but it's a population of 5 or 6 million people on one small island. So it's very limited, but it's a big city. And life there is very, very structured. So in cities, you can go to an app and you can find out exactly how many seconds away the bus that you want to take is away. It's how many seconds away before it will come to you, or how many minutes away. And so people will actually even go to a restaurant, or they'll go and do something because they know that the bus isn't going to come, or the train isn't going to come for 7 minutes and 12 seconds. So they know there's no reason to go and wait at the bus stop until 10 or 15, 20 seconds, 30 seconds before the bus arrives. It's so structured that they know exactly at what moment the bus or the train is going to arrive. And life there is very busy. People work from early in the morning or at maybe 8 or 9 o'clock until 5 o'clock. And so it's very congested because everybody's moving around that time. They budget exactly how long it takes to go from their house to their place of work. They budget their time. And if anything disrupts that, it get very, very stressful. Life is extremely structured. People have addresses, and you can just look at an address of a person. You can know exactly what floor they're on, how many. If it's a 45-story building, you can tell by the address what story they're on, where the apartment is. If you're in America, you can tell by the street numbers. You can tell whether it's on the north side or east side or west side or south side, the way that they structure that. And so city living or urban living is extremely structured. Not always, but it primarily is very, very structured. And so people live by these structures, and that's how they're able to make these cities work, is by having structure, by having organization. And so in the lifestyle that you find in urban churches is also very, very structured. Now consider a rural countryside. So rural areas, and people will say, well, the world is becoming more urban. It is in some places, and it isn't in other places. There's places in Africa, places in Asia that are still just as much rural as they were. Like in Cambodia, for example, it's still 70% rural and only 30% urban. It will probably remain that way for quite some time, although people continue to migrate to the cities, especially the younger people migrate to the cities. But we could see significant changes because many cities are really unsustainable, and so people are seeing the value living in a rural context. So if we consider the lifestyle of people in the countryside, it's very laid back. It's very laid back. People wake up when the sun wakes up or when the rooster crows. And I've gone and met with people in the village, say, hey, when can I come and visit you? In the city, if I said, when can I come and visit you, they would tell me a time, a date, to the exact hour. They would tell me exactly when I want them to call or when I want them to meet or come to my office. They'll give me the exact time. In the countryside, I remember one time I said, hey, when can I visit you? And the guy said, about like that. And I was like, what on earth is he talking about? And I realized he was pointing to the angle of the sun in the sky. And so when he was saying, why don't you come visit me when the sun is here, he was saying to come in the early evening. So if I come in the early evening as the sun is going down, and so it's a cooler time, better time to meet. Is that a specific time? Not really. If I came anytime after lunch or before nighttime, it would probably be fine for him if I just showed up approximately when he put his arm up and said he wanted me to come. Life is very much laid back, and if something happens in the village, somebody dies, the whole village stops. In an urban situation, they'll have to even budget the time for when people would be able to come to a funeral, and sometimes the funeral takes place 10 days or 7 days or sometimes even a month after somebody dies, because they embalm the body and keep the body in storage until people in the city can have enough free time or have a time that they think a large number of people and family members can come and have the funeral. In a funeral in the current countryside, for example, often they'll even do a funeral the same day or the next day after somebody dies, because people just drop everything. If something happens significant, they can just drop everything, and that's how life is. It's just laid back, and so they can do it. Of course, there are times when it's extremely busy in rural areas, and so you need to be aware of that. Sometimes urban people aren't aware of when it's very, very busy in rural situations. When do you think it's busy in rural areas? I'll give you time just to think for just a second, and then I'll tell you what it is. Okay, have you thought about it? So the times when it's really busy in rural areas is when? When you're planting, when you're harvesting, or when you have to do work to keep your crops going. That's when it's really, really busy. Or it could be like when cows or livestock are having their babies. Sometimes there's seasons when they're having their babies, and so those are extremely busy times. They cannot do other things during those times. So if you schedule a seminar or a training or discipleship course when it's planting season, don't be surprised when nobody shows up, because everybody's got to be planting. Or harvest season, or at a time when the livestock are having animals, are having their babies and things like that. Those are things that can affect with that. Now, if you look at the issue of time, for example, the issue of time. In the city, everything is by the clock. You got to have one of these and it better work. I remember going one time into a rural village, and there was a chief of the village. So it's actually a tribe called the Timon people. And I noticed the chief had a watch on. I was kind of impressed with that. And he said, could you help me fix my watch? And he said his watch hasn't worked in years, but he just kept wearing it because it looked really, really good. He actually never used the watch. So I took it back to the city since he was the chief, and I thought I'd get somebody to look at it. So they opened it up, and it was full of super glue that was inside. It was full of super, and there's no way the watch would ever work again. So I bought him a new watch and gave it to him. But he actually doesn't even know how to read the watch. But in the city, everybody knows. They put alarms on their phones, they have things, now we have these iWatches and that kind of stuff that will message you as stuff's coming in or things are going on, and Google calendars and things like that. Everything is highly structured, and time is down to the minutes, down to the second. I know that I have 10 minutes and 15 seconds left on this lesson, and I need to get this lesson done in the next 10 minutes and 15 seconds. That's how structured it is, But in the countryside, it's much more flexible. So in rural areas, time is much more flexible. So in the structure of the church in the city, for example, they want to keep the city, the churches, the programs that they do on Sundays or whatever day they worship. They want to do that to a very specific structure. We're going to worship for 7 minutes and 45 seconds, and then we're going to have a testimony time, and then we're going to have the message for no more than 25 minutes, and then we're going to have follow-up and invitation for people to come to Christ, and that's going to last no more than 5 minutes, and then announcements, and then we're going to close it off. And the entire time of the service could be like an hour or an hour and 15 minutes, and that's about it. You come to the rural areas, they sometimes feel cheated if you do. Only you meet together for an hour. They want to be able to talk and share and sit around and chat about what's going on in their lives and their family and discuss things, not just have somebody come up and preach at them, but actually discuss it. So as you're going through the Bible and preaching through the Bible, you can be interrupted quite often, and they want to say, hey, that didn't make any sense to me. Could you explain that to me? And you could have a service easily for 3 or 4 hours, and that's what is more appropriate in that context. So time in the urban setting and in the rural setting is very, very different. Also, in the city, we worship on Saturday or Sunday, depending on country. Some days have Sunday off, some days have Friday off. But why do they do that? Because everybody's working, everybody's busy, and so the services are mostly on Saturday and Sunday. So I want to ask you this. Does it matter in the rural context, that you worship on Sunday morning? I would have to tell you that I don't think it matters. Because for most people in rural contexts, especially rural farmers, it doesn't matter if it's Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, because there's no such thing as a weekend. There's no such thing as a weekday off from getting out of their place of employment. They work for themselves. They work for the ground. They work for the agriculture. They work for the crops that they have. And so there's not a weekend like there is in a city to have time off, and that's when people use that day of rest during that time. I find churches easily, I usually recommend they keep to a regular day, but some churches can meet on Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday or Friday or Saturday, and that is their weekly services during those times. And so time is considered very different. Now let's talk about accessibility. Accessibility is another issue. Like I was saying earlier about an address in the city, in urban context, like if you want to follow up with somebody, you can send a mail. You can, I'll visit a church and they ask for your information, you write it down, and then 3 or 4 days later or a week later, you get a letter in your post box, and they say, oh, thank you for visiting our church. If you have any questions, you can go to this website and you can find out information on our church, and we hope to see you again, and if we can connect you or help you anyways, let us know, and here's a phone number to call or an email address to go to, or there's information about the church. Can you do that in a rural context? Usually not. So accessibility in a city, you can, like if I want to find somebody, I can just go straight to their house, I can look at their address, I can know where they are. But in the rural context, it's often, hey, do you know where so-called house is? And people say, oh, so-called, I think if you go down to that tree, and then from that tree, you go and turn left, and then when you turn left, then I think you go down, to where you cross a river, and after you cross the river, then I think he might be down there, but I'm not sure if he's there because his cow had a baby, and the cow, it got scared and ran away, so he might be out looking for the cow. Do you think you could find him? It'd take a lot of time to try and find out where Sokal was, And so in the rural context, accessibility is harder to get where you're going, whereas in the city, and like I was talking about Singapore earlier, in the nation of Singapore, you can go to any point, anywhere in that country in under 2 hours. Anywhere you can get in under 2 hours because of the network of trains, of buses, of taxis, of a way that you don't even have to have a car or vehicle yourself to get around. Everything is there in the city. But in rural areas, it can be extremely difficult to try and get to places that have still not heard about the gospel, and extremely places to connect with people in those areas. And so accessibility is difficult in rural areas, and that's something you need to take in consideration when you're planting a church, is accessibility. Okay, how about target people? I want to tell you, I remember one time somebody came to, he was a pastor from Malaysia, and I invited him to come, and that's when cell groups was just coming out as a new model, and he said, I took him to a rural village to meet an amazing young lady who was an evangelist and sharing the gospel and just seeing a lot of different fruit. And many of her family members have come to Christ, and many people in her village have come to Christ. And he said he came to, and he talked to, we were actually all eating balut, or we call it like a baby duck fetus. So we're eating this unusual food together, and that's how they had their income, was by raising these baby duck or balut that are in an egg, and they eat those. And so we were sitting around eating some of those and talking together, and this pastor from Malaysia said, who's from a big city in Malaysia, a city of 5 million people, he said, you just need to believe for big numbers. You need to believe that God can do things. If you have a vision for a specific number of people, God will help you to reach that goal. And so this little lady, she said, I prayed about it, and I think God wants me to see 1,000 people in my church. And I didn't say anything at that point. But here we have a situation where the urban pastor didn't understand the rural context. The urban pastor comes from a city of 5 million people, so his target population is potentially millions of people. So he could have a megachurch. He could easily have 1,000 people if he had the system and structure and people and passion in place to be able to do it. But when we talked to this lady out in this village that raised balut for her livelihood, the entire village was less than 100 people. So he tried to tell her that if you have this vision for 1,000 people, that God will make it happen. Her target population is literally only a few hundred people. And so that's where we need to look at strategy for rural areas is different from strategies in urban areas. So if your church model is one that works well in an urban context, it's highly likely it will not work well in a rural context. Highly likely. It would almost be a fluke, or an accident if it worked well in a rural situation, because it's different. It's very different. So the target people is different. Let's look at one more thing. How about relationships? Now, I know everywhere in the world people think they have very, very close relationships. But if you're from the city, think about this. When was the last time you had an intimate conversation with your neighbor? Probably never. Probably never. Because people who are your neighbors are just randomly your neighbors. Especially if you're renting a place, people come and people go. If you happen to be in that place for a number of years, you maybe do have a conversation with your neighbor every once in a while, which is more like, hi, bye, and that's about it. But in the rural area, I can tell you, people know each other. They know everything about each other. Like, for example, in the rural areas, if somebody has a fight with their wife, and they have an argument with their wife and they're yelling at each other and that kind of stuff, the next morning, the entire village knows about it because they all listen. And so they come out and they say, oh, last night you really made a good point when you said that. And, the other women will say, you're such a terrible person when you were saying that to your wife. Da, 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 da. In the village situation, and obviously, and many times in smaller villages especially, sometimes the entire village are actually related to each other. So they're all extended family, so they've known each other not just for a number of years, since they were born, and when they go through the different stages of their life, they are all together. And so relationships are extremely close, and those family relationships are extremely important in rural areas. Whereas in urban areas, the relationships tend to be more shallow, more simple. They're, hey, hi, I know you, I know your job, I know but I don't know your family, I don't know what you're about, but I know you a little bit. And you may have a few good friends here and that kind of stuff, but people come and people go. So relationships are very different in the two contexts. So let's consider families in the two different contexts. So in urban context and rural context. Families in cities are often more distant. They're often in many different places, and they're often much smaller in cities. In rural areas, families are often very, very close, and they're often larger families than in the cities. It seems very common. It used to, even 20 years ago in Cambodia, I would meet families that had 10 children or 15 children, in rural areas. And once in a while, you'd meet somebody that had 4 or 5 children in an urban context, but not very rarely. I rarely in an urban context nowadays in Cambodia, like I have 4 children, and because I have 4 children, people's response in the city is always, oh, you have so many children, you know, and especially if you go into a more Western country like America or in Europe, if you have 2 children, they're just like, oh, how do you do it, you know? And then there's many places where couples get married, they live together, and they have no children. I mean, that you rarely see that in rural context, but in the urban situation, you often see that families are much smaller. Families are not as close. I'll tell you an example. 100 years ago, my family from the state of Iowa in America, in a small farming community, our family had been in the same village of Shellsburg, Iowa, for over 100 years. And we were one of the first 3 families to go there and to found the village that we were in over 100 years ago. And so over 100 years, if you look at this town of Shellsburg today, or the village of Shellsburg today, and I go there, most of the people in that town that haven't just recently moved in, most of them are actually related to me, you know, and they're part of a larger extended family, because over 100 years my family didn't move. And then in my father's generation, my father was the first to move away, and then his brother moved away, and then eventually his sister moved away. So there's only 3 in their family. My grandparents' family had 10 to 12 children each in their family, but then they had only 3 children, 2 boys and a girl, and they each 2 of them moved to different states, so nearby but a different state. So they moved a matter of 5-6 hours away, and then my father moved the furthest. He moved to the Philippines, so he moved on the other side of the world, and so our family began to move away. And then the next generation, which is my generation, I have 9 cousins, and so of the 9, my family only had 2 children, and the others, we had one of my uncle had 4, so that's quite a lot, and the other one had 3, so quite similar. But you know what? We're spread out all over the world. I've got a cousin in Israel. I live in Cambodia. We're spread across all the United States, in Washington, D.C., and different states across America are spread out all over the place. And then we're also seeing that our families are intermarrying. So we're now married to different ethnic people. So my wife is Cambodian, so from Asia. I've got another cousin that's married to a Bedouin from Israel, and so that's from an Arab or Bedouin background. I have another cousin who's married to Hispanic background, so from Southern Americas. I'm not sure which country exactly, but and so originally we were all from the same village, but now it's becoming much more mixed, and as we travel around the world, we're ethnically more mixed and things like that. These are all things which affect the way you do church planting, because the core family, the nuclear family, has changed a lot compared to what it used to be as well. Okay, what about the economy? Well, let me tell you, in urban situations, the economy is work or die, work or die. I find it really amazing. I find it hard for urban people to understand, how do people in the city, in the rural areas, how do they even survive? They don't have a grocery store. They don't have access to indoor plumbing. They don't have they don't have all the conveniences of the city. How do they even survive? Well, the economy is different. The economy is often based on agriculture. But also, here's one thing very interesting. So in the city, if you want to eat an apple, you just go to the store and you buy an apple and you eat an apple. If you're in the countryside and you want to eat an apple, you better hope somebody has an apple tree. But I tell you what, if they do have an apple tree, they share. And so people share with each other. So if someone if they have a pig that's about ready to be harvested, and so they harvest the pig, they share with each other, and everybody gets a little bit of pork that night. If somebody's tree is in mango season and they start to get mangoes, and everyone's like, hey, come and help yourself and get some mangoes, and people kind of help themselves anyway. So everybody just shares, and they survive. They survive. They may not have access to considerable wealth to buy things like the latest brand or the latest iPhone or the latest clothes, that kind of stuff. They probably don't even care about those things. But the economy is very, 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 very different. And that's something you need to consider also. When we know that for Christians we want to give to the Lord. So the way that Christians give in an urban context is always cash, almost always just cash. You give of your time, you give of your abilities back to the Lord, to serve in the church, to serve other people. But mostly we pass a bucket around and we get cash, and then we use that cash to serve the Lord. If your focus is on cash in rural areas, that pass the bucket around and get cash, you may not get much of anything back. And so I think it's where we need to consider in the church when people give of their offerings to the Lord. The principle remains the same, but they give in different ways. And so they may give of land. They may give a portion of their harvest. They may give fruits. They help those that are in need through their giving. They help the leaders of the church, or they help the poor in their community. They give with their actual resources that they actually can, in terms of tangible resources, which may or may not be cash. And so that's different. The economy is quite different. Morality in urban situations and rural, urban and rural is very, very different. It's when I come from a rural concept and you look at a city, it seems like there's no morality at all. Anything goes. Whatever gender you want to be, whoever you want to sleep with, just do whatever you want. It's all about you, and you can be whatever you want, do whatever you want. It seems like there's no standard of morality at all. In the rural context, they don't even know what to think about that. So if you come from an urban situation and your moral standard is one way, or you don't have a moral standard, and you come into a rural context, realize that you may not be received well just because of the perception of the immorality that you bring. It may deal with what you wear, the way you talk, what you talk about, the terminology you have. It may affect, because the morality in cities is often almost non-existent, or it's more about just whatever you're supposed to accept everyone for whatever they want to do, whatever they want to believe, whatever they want to live like. You're supposed to accept them for that. In the rural context, they probably will not accept you if you just do whatever you want to do. So the moral structure is very different. It's often more conservative and often more traditional. So when I go to villages in Cambodia, I found the simple thing of if I wear shorts, they tend to not receive me as somebody who is a proper teacher of God's Word. But if I wear pants and a collared shirt, I am received better because of the perception of the way they perceive things. They're more traditional, they're more conservative. When I go, and I go with my wife, especially if the two of us go, we're treated in a different way for us than if we're a single person. Are treated differently because of the perception of the morality. So what about education? Well, in a city, education is very important. It's highly valued. People want to excel, and they can often get a better job. They can get higher on the ladder of success in urban situations according to the academic degrees they have. So the more degrees I have, the more I can do in an urban environment. In the rural areas, education, first of all, it's not as accessible, and so people may not have access to education. In fact, when have you ever heard of a Bible school in a rural area? They're almost always in cities. When have you ever heard of a great university in a rural area? They're almost always in cities. Why is that there's no universities in rural areas? It's not a desire. Of course, land is cheaper, but it's not a desire for people. They are more focused on what they can practically do to survive themselves. They may not see any value of an education beyond 3rd or 4th or 5th grade. And I find in most of the rural situations that I work in, it's quite rare for people to have education even to high school graduate level. In the urban situation, almost always people have graduated at least from high school, if not gone on for a bachelor's or master's or even doctorate degree. In the rural area, I rarely find people in the areas that I work that finish year 12 or finish their high school or upper secondary education. I rarely find that because it's not valued in the same way. It doesn't get you ahead in life. If you plant the rice, that's how you get ahead in life. That's how you eat. If you know how to harvest, if you know how to fix some machinery, that's what's valuable in the rural area. So education is perceived differently. So if you offer a bachelor's degree in church planting in a rural area, I doubt anybody will sign up. But you offer it in an urban context, like we're doing here, and most of you with access to the internet, you're learning this in an urban context. The degree is of value to you, but for a rural church planter, it has basically no value to get a degree for what you learn. Okay, what about ethnicity? Ethnicity in urban context, you can have many, many ethnicities. You can have hundreds and hundreds of nationalities, ethnic backgrounds, languages spoken all in one place. It's quite common to have churches that will have 5, 10, 15 different ethnic groups that are represented in the church. And that's a very urban thing. If you go to the village situation, you usually only have one ethnicity, one language spoken, one tribe of people or one people group, and that's it. And so the ethnicity is just a single ethnos. And so because of that, the way that you work with them is different. The languages you use is different. If you have multilingual group with multiple languages, you have to find a main language that can be the median language between all of them. But if you try to use, for example, a national language in a village that only has one ethnicity and one language spoken that may not be the same as the national language, you're not going to do well. You're going to have to use the language of the people in that village. So that's something to consider, is the ethnicity and language of the people. Well, let's talk about dreams too. In the urban areas, what do people dream about in urban areas? They dream about the latest brand. Oh, even my kids, they're always talking about the latest brand and that kind of stuff. It drives me crazy being a dad, and the latest kind of phone. And to me, all the new smartphones, they all look alike, whether it's a Huawei or Oppo or iPhone or Samsung. They all look the same. They basically have the same kind of features and that kind of stuff. But people in the city be like, oh, that's too bad you have an iPhone 7. If you had the iPhone 12, that would really be cool, or things like that. It's so important about, the dreams are about material things. The dreams are about the latest things. That's what the media is pushing at us and advertising is pushing at us. And it's about image, it's about perspective, and it's about all these kind of things that just keep growing and building and that kind of stuff. And what are the dreams of people in the village? They don't dream about the different kinds of phones and the latest this and the latest gadget and that kind of stuff. They may dream about maybe having some more property. They may dream about a cow. They may dream about different things, but it won't be the kind of materialistic dreams that people have in the city. So that affects too the way that you bring the gospel to them, the way that you share the gospel, the way that you grow the church, and the things that you offer in the group of believers together, the things that you offer, it affects that. If you're not reaching what their dreams are, then they may not have a draw to the group of believers if you're not addressing their dreams. But if you take the rural concept of dreams and that kind of stuff to the urban situation, it's not going to work either, because they're so different. What about technology? In the village, the technology is constantly changing, constantly. Even during COVID, during these times of COVID going on right now, we see technology is constantly changing. In the village, I can take you to villages where they're still harvesting by hand, they're still planting by hand, they're still beating the rice off by hand, they're still dehusking the rice by smashing it down by hand. It hasn't changed in thousands of years. And sometimes the technology, even the newer technology that comes in, is actually very, very old technology. They bring in a combine or something to help them harvest now. And the combine technology is already over 100 years old. So the technology is very low tech, it's inexpensive. So if you bring something, for example, like an LCD screen or LCD projector into a village, you're bringing in this piece of technology which they can't even relate to. Not only that, they don't care about it, but if you bring that technology, if you don't have that technology in the city, you're maybe going to have an obstacle, because you see, even the technology is different. So what about churches? I can tell you this, in the city, there's almost like a competition between churches, which is very, very sad. But who has the latest, the greatest, the best children's program? Who has the best playground for children in the school? Who can attract young families? Who can attract professionals? Who have this? Who have that? Who has the best band? Who has the best air-conditioned room? And in the local areas, what are the options of churches? Usually just one. Or two or three, and they're all quite similar. Or there's one Protestant and one Catholic, and that's about it. The options are different between churches. And so that makes a difference also in the kind of churches that you go and plant. Because in the urban area, if you try and plant a church, you need to consider, although we don't like to talk about competition, that kind of stuff, you have to market yourself, you have to present stuff that are going to make a difference for people. And you've got to do that differently in an urban situation as you would in a rural situation. So those are very, very different. So you can see here, when we compare the urban church and the rural church, the way you plant churches are very, very different between these two groups, because those two general groups of people, and obviously there's different variations on everybody, but those two different groups of people, urban people and rural people, they think very, very differently. They act very, very differently. They have completely different worldviews. And so the way that you work and you plant churches and you share the gospel amongst the rural people is essentially very, very different than you would amongst urban people. The gospel of Jesus remains the same, but the package in which we put it in, the structure that we have to bring the gospel to the people, it looks very, very different. And so we need to consider that in church planting in rural context, and also if you're working in urban context, you need to consider how you would plant churches in an urban context. You may not be successful in an urban context because you're trying to do what worked in a rural context where you came from in a faraway village. You're trying to do that same thing in the city that you're living in now, and it's not working. So if you look at these things, these are some things you need to address in your own methodology as you're trying to plant churches between urban and rural places. Thank you very much for this time together, and we'll continue with different issues related to church planting in subsequent lessons.